You can animate almost anything in Maya, and animation works similar to animation on paper. All you need to do is define keyframes and you can animate almost anything in Maya. The most common things may be the position of an object, its orientation or scale, but you can also animate textures or shaders of an object. You can animate lights, etc. So in this tutorial, we're going to animate two things in our scene. First of all, we're going to animate an object, and then we're going to animate the camera. So to do that, you should be familiar with the interface, the animation interface, which is this bottom bar. And first we have the time slider. And this is this first slider here on the top. So you can scroll through frames here, or you can press play and navigate your animation. Since nothing is animated yet, you won't really see anything right now. Underneath that, we have our range slider, and this is similar to a zoom. So this controls the timeline, what section of your timeline you're working on. So this is really helpful for longer animations where you want to maybe focus on a certain segment, and you can lower your range, and then this will make your time slider larger for you to see. And next to that, we have our frame rate, and make sure to set it at 30 frames per second right now. So we'll be mostly working at either 30 frames or 60 frames per second when animating. And this is kind of the way that you can view your animation. So you can have it looping, or it can loop only once. So if you click on this arrow, there's different looping settings. There is an audio option, and you can also manage the volume. And then this last button here is the animation settings. So if you click on this, you'll get these different preferences that are very similar to the settings that you can put directly on the animation interface. It's just another way of viewing it. So for example, we have the frame rate, which we looked at down here. We have the playback start and end, which are these buttons down here, so 1 and 58. The animation start and end, which would be 1 and 250, we have down here too. And to explain these a little bit further, your animation start and end is the total length of your animation. And then your playback start and end is maybe just a section of your animation that you're working on. And say we wanted to make a 10-second animation. So if we know we're working at 30 frames per second and we want our animation to be 10 seconds, that would mean that we would need to have 300 frames. So let's change our end to 300, and that way we know we have now a 10-second animation going on. And if I switch this, you'll see that it has automatically updated down here. And then another useful setting to know is the playback speed. So you can either select your 30 frames per second, which is what we've set down here, or we can set it to play every frame. This is useful when you're working with dynamics or cloth simulations, for example, and you want to be able to review every frame that's playing. But for now, we'll just set it at 30 frames per second. You can also slow it down, or you can speed it up. But anyways, this all just has to do with your playback. So it's not actually how your animation will render out and look like. It's just kind of a preview of your animation. So let's leave it at 30 frames per second for now. And we can save and close this. So first, let's animate an object. And I want to animate my entire candle to maybe drop and roll down. So let's take a look at how we can do that. We want this to last maybe our 10 seconds, and throughout these 10 seconds, the way that this candle falls and rolls down will have different events. So let's bring our time slider all the way down to our first frame, and make sure you are in the animation submenu. Okay, so in the animation submenu, you should have a key menu, and your first option is set key, and you'll see to the right of it the hotkey for setting a key is S. So if you press S in your keyboard, it's the same thing as pressing set key here in this menu. So once we selected our start frame in the time slider, we can select the object we're going to animate and then press S to keyframe all of its attributes at once. And you'll see now that after I pressed S, all of these boxes in my attributes menu have switched to red, and there's also a red tick down here. So this lets you know that this object now has been keyframed. So let's say that we want to know the end position now of this candle. Let's go to the end of our time slider, and here we want to kind of grow the range because we want to make sure we're going all the way to the end, and select the end position for your candle. So once you have that end position, and make sure you're in the last frame in your time slider, you can press S again. So now if I go back and I play my animation, you can see how my object is moving. And now say that in between this, I wanted something else to happen. So, for example, say that I want this to drop much sooner before it slides to the end of the table. Maybe it takes just 1.5 seconds, so go to frame 45. And in frame 45, let's say I already want my candle to kind of drop down. So set it in position, and then you can add a keyframe again by pressing S. So now if I go back through my animation, you can see that there's this action happening in between from what I had set in the beginning and end. And then you can always go back and edit in between. So say now from here to here, I want my candle to kind of start jumping a little bit or bouncing. So I can always select a frame and then maybe bring it up. And then keyframe that and then maybe I quickly wanted to jump down, so move to my next frame and have that maybe jump down and set my keyframe again, pressing S. So let's play this again. So I mean, this is a kind of a silly animation, but you get a sense of how you can start to animate your objects, right? And have a start and end maybe scene, and then from there go in between and start editing what happens in between the start and end. Now, if I wanted to edit something in my animation, say for example, this last section I feel takes too long and it just drags around, and maybe I want to make it shorter, I can hold down the shift key under my time slider and drag my mouse and select a range of keyframes or a range of time that can be edited. So let's say I want to bring this keyframe in the end closer to my beginning of the animation. So I'll hold down the shift key and select it. And then with your middle mouse button, you can click and drag this keyframe in your time slider. So if I go back now, you'll see that this is shorter. And maybe it makes sense now that this is shorter. In between this drag, maybe I can add another bounce. So I'll go to this frame and maybe bring my candle up, and again press S to keyframe it again. Okay, so this is what my animation looks like now. So now let's animate our camera. So let's select our camera and see where we have it right now. And again, we can first animate the beginning and end of our animation and then go in between. So let's go to our camera panel and let's select the starting point. And so let's play our animation just to see what we're looking at. Okay, so let's say that in my 10-second animation, what I wanted to do is to kind of loop around. So start my view here and then maybe orbit around and end somewhere over here and maybe zoom in. So this is the last point where I want my view to be. So let's go ahead and keyframe this last view, only this time we're going to keyframe just under our transform attributes. So instead of keyframing everything for our camera, we'll only keyframe its translation and rotation. So I'll right click over translate and set key. I'm in my last keyframe, and then maybe the rotation will also need to be set. So we have this last frame, and now let's go find our first frame. So maybe our first frame will be a more general view up here. So make sure you're on your first frame, and then go again to your camera attributes and set your keys. So if I slide my time now, I have my beginning and my end. But you can see that in between, I'm not really seeing anything great, and I want to be able to always follow my candlestick around. So this drops, and maybe I want to make my camera look at my candlestick. So I can move my camera around and then again keyframe this view. And then let's keep playing. So let's say that here I want to have my camera look at my entire table. So again, go to translate and set this key and set the rotate key. So now I'm constraining my camera movements to always look at my candlestick. Maybe I want to be down here now. And again, set my key. Okay, so this looks much better. If you ever want to delete a key, you can always select it by going on your time slider and then make sure that your shaded boxes in your attribute are dark red. If they're light red, you're not on a keyframe, you're in between keyframes. So make sure you're on a keyframe, and then you can right click and press delete, and this will delete your key. So say that you wanted to make a different view. So, or maybe even you realize that you don't need that extra key because your scene is already working without it. Then you can just delete it out. Okay, so this is our camera animation. And before we render out our animation, I want to show you one last thing, which is how to animate a shader. So since we're working on our candle, let's decide to have it change colors. So in the beginning it can have this blue color, but when it ends, maybe we want it to be a different color. So select maybe just the stick of your candle, and under its attributes, you should be able to see its shader. And you can right click on color and then set a key. And so this will tell Maya that when the animation starts, the candlestick should be that tone. But when it ends, maybe I want it to be a different color. So say I want it to be this purple. Click done. Make sure you're on the end of your animation, and then again right click over color and set this key. And you'll see that the checkered box has disappeared, and now there's a node. And this node is basically saying that on frame 1, this is the value, the color value, and then on frame 300, this is the color value. So let's go back to the shader. You can either click on this arrow to go back one step, or just click on the Lambert tab on top. And let's look at our animation. Maybe we want to deselect our candlestick so we can see the color changing. Okay, so now I have this ramp that changes the color value from this blue to this purple. And I'm happy with the way my animation looks, and I'm ready to render it out. So to do this, we can open up our render settings and our render view. And under our render settings, when working with an animation, there's different things we need to be able to set. So first of all, let's call our file name a different name. So maybe we can call it camera 1, so we know that that's the animation that we're working on, the camera 1 animation. And then we can leave the image format with JPEG. One important thing to set when you're working with your animation is this frame animation extension. So this will actually add an extension to your file name. Since we're rendering out 300 frames in total, we need to be able to number out each different image as a frame number. So if we go to name underscore number for our extension, and you look up here, this is how our files will start to be named. So camera 1 underscore and then the frame number. And make sure you have your frame padding set to 4. If you have a lower number, this means that we'll only have 2 digits. And if you're working with, say, a 3-minute animation, then you'll need to start having more than 3 digits, because a 3-minute animation is 180 seconds, and if we have 30 frames per second, that means that we would need to multiply 180 seconds per 30. So we're already in the thousands, and we'll have like thousands of images, so we need to have at least 4 digits in our file name. Okay, so we have our naming set correctly, and next would be our frame range. So we want to tell Maya to start rendering our image at frame 1 and to finish at frame 300, because that's the length of our 10-second animation. And then just you can leave by frame 1, and this just tells it to render every 1 frame. On renderable cameras, make sure you set it to render out your camera 1. And then since we're going to render out 300 frames, and this is going to take quite a while, we may want to work with a smaller image size for this test. So let's just make a 600 pixel image, and then everything is fine now. You can obviously also work with refining your render settings. So remember, the higher samples, the longer your images will take to render, but the higher the quality will be. But you want to find the right setting for your computer so that it doesn't take too long to render too. So I'm going to leave these settings right now to 2. And maybe just my camera samples, I'll leave it 4. And now once we have our render settings ready, we can go to our render view. And to render an animation, instead of going to render and selecting your camera, you would have to go to render sequence and select the box to open up our options for that action. And so with this box open, we want to assign the correct camera to render, so camera 1. And then our projects should be set correctly, but if for some reason you wanted to render your animation to a different output file location, you could always assign it here. And once that's ready, all you need to do is hit render sequence. And Maya will start rendering your scene, and it'll start from frame 1, and it'll automatically, when it finishes, start rendering your second frame, and so on. So if I go to my project window, to my images folder, you should see that I'm starting to get my animation here.